Fantastic. So thank you all very much for joining. I would very much like to welcome Dr. Ellie Davison, who has already shared a fantastic presentation on their approach in Science Foundation Year in improving engagement in online peer activities around assessment, which I hope you've all had a chance to see. So welcome, Ellie, and good morning.
Hi, Mike. Thank you very much for having me. So as I said, you've seen the presentation, hopefully, so we can just have a chat about it, and I'd be really interested to hear everybody's opinions and thoughts. So get chatting and typing away, that'd be great. So I think we had a thought, Mike, about how to kick off. You asked me a couple of questions. And this was the first one that you asked me, was how did the staff involved find getting to grips with Talis Elevate, and how do you manage sort of that kind of online session where you're having students contributing live? I would just say play with it, really. Take time to have maybe a meeting with some staff in your department and just have a mess about so that you're really familiar with it. What's also helpful as well is we tend to have a dummy student login for anything that we want to trial, so that we're seeing things from the student perspective, because it can just be slightly different. So get yourself a dummy student login, a couple of mates, and just have a play with it, really. And then what I found really useful was having two screens, so that I could have the kind of the collaborate meeting on one screen and then the Talis on another. So that I could see both things going on at the same time. And then the other thing that I'd just say is don't worry if it goes wrong. You know, students love to see you struggling a little bit, makes you feel a little bit more human, makes them not feel so rubbish when they say things that aren't quite right, or they go wrong a little bit. So embrace the errors.
I think that's great. So you've shared kind of two thoughts around there. That you've said about how technically you've managed it with the two screens. The dummy student account is always great for technology, but also you've said that about playing and just getting comfortable with it, and I think that must have helped your staff confidence with delivering it then.
Yeah, I think so. When you've always had a go, I wouldn't want to go at something cold. So yeah, absolutely. Just have a play would be my best advice.
Fantastic. So whilst we move on to the next question, if anyone has any other questions for Ellie, drop them into the chat, raise your hand. We can start to challenge her a little bit more on some of the great work that she's been doing. This was another question from me.
Yeah, so we talked a lot about marking rubrics in the presentation. So you asked about the language of the marking rubric and if it kind of led to any alterations once the students started working with it. I think my answer would be to take time in that initial input to really talk through the marking rubric and what these words mean, give examples of how certain criteria would be met or just missed, so that students get really familiar with it. But part of using Talis and PeerMark is that students have used this marking rubric to evaluate kind of 4 different submissions by the time they come to write their own. So it's incredibly embedded and they're really familiar with it. But if you wanted to pick something out of the rubric while you're using Talis and go on a bit of a hunt for it, I think that can be useful. So if you pulled out your critical analysis marking descriptor and said, okay, everybody go and find a little bit of critical analysis, would that meet the descriptor? So a bit of a treasure hunt with some of the words on your marking rubric, I think, can help.
Definitely. Christopher's just raised an interesting point in the chat as to, to what extent do we go about justifying our learning activities to students? Christopher, did you want to come off mute and expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, can do. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Boom, brilliant. New headset today, so just checking it out. Yeah, I guess a lot what I've found in my own practice throughout COVID is that everyone's really stressed. So students want to know a little bit more as to why we're doing things to them, in inverted commas, why we're asking them to do stuff. And I just wonder if part of that obviously very positive atmosphere that you create where you just give it a go, and I completely agree, students do love to see us flounder a little bit. I think it makes us a bit more human.
Yeah.
I just wondered how much you explained this, because it's probably a bit of a break from their normal sort of teaching activities, it's probably something quite novel to them as well. I wonder how much you kind of explicitly say to them, you're going to get this out of it, rather than saying, we're going to do this so that you can do the peer review stuff, the other stuff that they get from it. I wonder how far you go with that.
I think students respond really well if you give the pedagogic reasons behind things. Even presenting some research on how this is going to help you develop. I think the buy-in's a lot better if students know why they're doing something, as well as, you know, we're just going to make you play with this thing, which is really complicated. That, yeah, I would be really, really explicit about how it's going to help. Perhaps get student testimonials from previous years on things that are a bit tricky. I think that can help as well.
Yeah, bro, cheers. Looks brilliant.
I love that comment, Christopher, about you know, why are we doing things to students, and yeah, it's about flipping that around. Doing things with students is going to be far
That's
more
what we
engaging.
always mean, isn't it? But I guess sometimes it can feel a little bit like the other.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. I think the third question that you asked me, Mike, was are there any risks with running peer review activity, and what do we do to kind of mitigate those risks? I think I touched on them a little bit in the presentation. We did worry if we're relying on peer review, what if some non-engaged student decides that they're not ready to play that week? So we asked students to complete 3 peer reviews in the hope that if somebody didn't engage, they'd at least get 2 peer reviews, and that wouldn't feel so bad. But actually engagement was way better than we expected, and everybody submitted all 3 peer reviews. I think because they wanted theirs back. It was a little bit of a reciprocal arrangement. And the way that I say that we set it up, if somebody wasn't going to contribute their own draft to review, they didn't get to review themselves, and that worked really well. The other thing you could do is give credit for writing a review. And if you want to kind of assess those reviews, give varying credit depending on the quality of that review. That's something that you might want to have a go at.
That's a great point, and I think that answers Dan's question in the chat around incentivizing students for this activity. So you've said that actually the intrinsic reward of having their work reviewed is the incentive.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm just reading the chat, that's why I'm staring at the screen.
I know, I am as well. And so yes, Dan has followed up with that actually by accrediting some percentage of marks works well as well to drive that engagement.
Yeah. This is a question really that's kind of for everybody. Over this year, we've seen that students with additional responsibilities have thrived, really. It's kind of been a bit of a relief to some students that they do get to participate in a much more flexible way. The question really is, should we, moving forward, as we're allowed, if we want to go back to more traditional ways of teaching, should we actually try and include flexible participation options in as many teaching and learning activities as we can?
And yeah, I'm really keen to hear some engagement from our participants here on the answer to this question. You know, what flexible participation options should we take forward into next year, because we're all planning for the next academic year. What flexibility in this type of activity are people bringing to the table for next year?
My kind of initial thoughts is we should make everything as flexible as possible, but acknowledging that the risk then is perhaps for students who don't need that flexibility, it does make it easier to leave things till later. I think you've kind of got this dual. It's brilliant for students who need the flexibility to fit it into their life, but it is easier to disengage if you're a procrastinator. So what's the balance with that?
I think it's Emily has just raised a very interesting point. We're asking that question of educators. Has anyone asked their student groups this question?
Ours want flexibility. I think having had it, it's going to be very hard to give up. I just saw a question coming in from Faye from the library. Can you use it for other non-reading material? I believe you can upload anything you like to Talis. So and that includes videos now. That was a recent release. So and if you can annotate videos and put comments in the timeline of a video, just as you can with text. So I think it's pretty flexible.
Yes, video works well, and also we've seen some good examples coming out of the College of Arts around, I think, architecture as well, where they're PDF files, but it's a diagram, maybe a technical diagram, and people are highlighting certain points across the diagram.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask Ellie, because I think we were really interested in the library to see this example, because we're much more used to it being used with books and journals, so getting the students to engage with that material. But it's really brought up a few thoughts really about using it around, you know, assignment questions because of the anonymous part of it. So, you know, we often are asked questions around essays and things, but it'd be quite good to ask you, you know, without it being done in front of people, because they're often quite embarrassed about doing that. Or so I was just wondering if you thought about expanding it a little bit, because that's something we'd not thought about, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if Tom's here, because Tom's a mathematician, and I know he's been using it to look at maths posters, but also to annotate mathematical solutions, so you can start to spot errors in working out. I don't know if he's here. There he is. Do you want to say how you might use it in some more unexpected areas, Tom?
Yeah, so I saw Ellie do this in the in semester A in the study skills module, and had thought I would steal the idea for when we did a stats poster. So what we did was I put in a previous poster that somebody else had done, and we used it to then pick up not just on like things like the structure of the poster and bits that were particularly good, or bits that could have been presented a little bit nicer, but we were able to then discuss like why the student had done this sort of progression, like why did they do this stats test first, why did they then have to go on to do this bit, why did they not do that thing. So it became not just about like the structure, but it became like a learning tool for understanding why we did particular stats analysis in a particular way, in a particular order. So things like testing for normality would allow us to do a parametric test, which then that meant that the discussion that we had subsequently in Collaborate, we were able to really, people were asking like, well, why can't I do a t-test? Why can't I do this? Why is that number? Why is that number really high? So it moved it from not just like a structural like formatting thing, but also into a into actual a context. I'm trying to think of the right word, like content based rather than just assessment style based, which was really useful.
Brilliant, thanks, Tom. Okay. Another question for everybody really is, when we're using Tallis and PeerMap, all the students rave that they can contribute anonymously, and they just think that's the best thing ever. And I do agree to a certain extent that if you're a shyer student, then it can really kind of help you to contribute. Are there any contexts though where we say, actually, you need to put your name to things now? You know, you can't go through life anonymously. Is there a point in your degree or different contexts where we say you need to put your name to your evaluation?
I think it's a really good question. I'm keen to see responses from a few people. There was a comment earlier in the chat around how students of different levels might respond to this type of activity, first years and third years, and how that confidence grows or the trust grows. And maybe there's an avenue we could explore there around anonymity.
Yeah. So Christopher in the chat has just put, is it a scaffolding and a gradual kind of improvement of confidence? And I think maybe you're right. You know, we're foundation, and they come in with some knocked confidences sometimes. So perhaps getting familiar with this activity, familiar with the tools in an anonymous capacity, and they may bringing in more. I imagine it's easier to contribute with your name in smaller group, more safe sessions to begin with, and gradually increase confidence. I think that's a good way to go about it.
Seeing the word scaffolding just appear again, and that's what we want. So I think what I think I'll ask you an unexpected question, Ellie. For people that are new to both TALIS and peer review activities, how do you go about that step one of scaffolding and introducing a brand new activity like this?
I think two things. There's the technology and then there's the task. So when we've done student experience panels, they asked us to very explicitly give examples of how to give feedback. So they want some written examples of how to link it to the marking rubric, how to make it constructive rather than critical. And they sort of wanted some very laid out, smart feedback examples in front of them. So I think that's something, don't forget the session on how to give feedback, because it might be something that students haven't done before. And then in terms of the technology, I would get it out in a very informal session, maybe in a tutorial, maybe in Welcome Week, with something that's not linked to assessment, that's not really linked to subject content perhaps. And I think playing's a great way of familiarity.
Okay, so just a quick reminder, we have 5 minutes to go on this discussion session.
So this is flipped, Mike. I'm going to flip it back. Is TALIS accessible?
I knew
can
you
we
would
have the
ask me
expert
that.
opinion?
So for those in the group that don't know me, inclusive and accessible pedagogy is probably my biggest passion in education. And that comes down to a digital accessibility and the inclusiveness in which we approach our teaching and learning as well. TALIS Elevate is a pretty accessible tool. It does function with screen readers. You can tab through the page, you can access it in various ways. You do have the option of changing color and contrast on the screen. But digital accessibility is a roaming scale, and it does come down to students' digital skills as well. Obviously, sometimes things can be made more accessible by having some tools on your local PC, and can be hindered in terms of accessibility depending on what device you're accessing it on. So overall, it does have some quite strong accessibility features, and one of the benefits of TALIS as a relatively new company in the EdTech field, or certainly TALIS Elevate being a new product for TALIS, is that they are making lots of constant developments. As we've already said, video has been recently added to Elevate. There are lots of changes, and they're a very dynamic company, so they're quite responsive. So if you do find accessibility challenges with this software, let them know. They're very, very responsive.
So should we ask Beatrix to get TALIS to make a downloadable version?
I think it's fantastic. So Beatrix in the chat said that it would be great to be able to download the output of your Elevate with all the comments, and I'll be asking TALIS that directly. Yes, definitely.
Great for various reasons. So you can actually have like a pre-learning, then you take it in class and go on based on the records, but also so if you actually do something then in class, students can take it away. And yes, there are other ways to do that, say on shared documents in Teams and things, but it offers other features like being anonymous in a much more readily available way, and of course videos and all that. So that would be my one hope for Christmas on the list. Put it there.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, kind of a linked but a broader discussion point. So students, we're giving them all this feedback. How do we actually encourage them to then use that feedback, both in the kind of immediate sense for their summative submission, and then also moving forwards? Any thoughts on that from the group would be appreciated.
We're in our final minutes of the discussion.
Okay. So while you're thinking and writing things down, I have heard some suggestions of, again, giving credit to a bit of a reflection on how you've read your formative feedback and used it to make improvements before your summative. And there are credits for that reflection for how you've made those improvements. So that might be something that we want to think about as we move forwards.
Good. Okay, so as we approach our final minutes of this discussion, I'd like to thank everybody for participating and joining. I'm really happy to see the chat window full and people coming off mute. Just a final question and to think about is what out of this sort of practice, this approach to peer activity and peer review, are we going to carry forward into next year? And Ellie, if you want to just kind of end on that question, what are you going to take forward into next year from this?
Yeah, so we're never going back, Mike. This is brilliant. All we're going to do is try and apply it to more and more contexts. Flexibility, I think, is key for our students, being able to contribute in many different ways easily, and that's exactly what we're going to take forward. So as I've put the final question up as well, of can we bombard the chat with wild and wacky ways of how you might use Talis Elevate to give us all a bit of inspiration?
That's fantastic. I think this has been such an interesting discussion to see your use of Talis Elevate, your use of peer review work, to see other people share great ways that they've used Talis. And actually, it looks like people have been quite inspired by your use of peer review work, and that if it's structured and if it's scaffolded, being the key term, it can be really, really successful. And hopefully people aren't scared of that type of peer review activity with students.
Yeah.
Grand. At that point, I think I'll call this session to a close. So thank you very much to Ellie. Thank you very much to everybody that participated. For those of us that are part of the Teams site for this conference, there is a dedicated discussion channel in Teams. I'll put a post in there and we can carry on this conversation asynchronously within the Teams discussion as well. I really, really appreciate all of you spending your time with us this morning.
Thanks, guys.